In a bizarre but potentially troubling story coming out of Canada, a jiu-jitsu white belt who had done a competition and gotten injured in the competition, or at least so he says, is suing his coach, who also was a leader of the tournament. Now, what's interesting about this is that there are waivers that are signed both when you're signing up for a school, you have a waiver to train there, but also there are waivers when you're competing. And despite there being waivers in place, when this was brought to a Canadian court, they actually pushed it forward and let the suit continue. So we don't actually know where this is going to go. This is a fairly new story. So hopefully we get an update on this, and I'll try to do a video on that when that happens. But the fact that this even got through is kind of surprising. Now, if this does work out where the white belt wins the lawsuit, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to change any kind of common law in any other country. So it's not like that would change the laws in the U.S. or anything. But it would give people in America who see that a white belt was successful in suing after an injury potential reason to try to file a lawsuit if they are feeling in a similar way. And I think that'd be a big issue, especially with a lot of these schools having owners who aren't exactly extremely rich. So for them, just having to put forth the money to defend against a lawsuit could really be crippling to their business and their lifestyle. So it's definitely something that's worrisome. So let's go through the article and see what they're saying in here. So the article I'm looking at right now from the Jiu-Jitsu Times is kind of a repost of an article from the CBC. So I'll get to that one too. But they're saying, not a joke headline: a Canadian white belt is suing his coach for injury sustained in his first grappling competition. Says that he was put in the wrong weight class and not adequately trained in stand-up, which this is a bizarre part. Not adequately trained in stand-up before facing an opponent who tore his meniscus. So it doesn't really detail the injury itself, but if I had to guess, if it's a gi jiu-jitsu match and the guy tore his meniscus, he probably got thrown over his knee. I haven't had my meniscus torn, but I've had some injuries with that sometimes, especially if it's a competition and the guy you're going against isn't all too concerned about whether or not he bends you over your knee, so that can happen. So that's an assumption on my part, but I'm assuming that's the case. But they're saying, yes, it's a real news story again. According to a civil complaint filed in British Columbia, Joe Peters had been training at Marcus Suarez's gym for 8 to 9 months, signed a couple of waivers, but the suit alleges that, or it was allowed to proceed in spite of the signed waivers because Peters' lawyer argues that the waivers did not cover the competition and because coaches were negligent in preparing Peters for competition. And this is just absolutely bizarre to me. And when they had an interview with the lawyer, and that interview is about 7 minutes long, I'm not going to include it in here, but the argument that the guy wasn't properly trained for competition is a crazy argument if you think about it, because there's so much that can happen in a competition, whether it's the stand-up, which some gyms don't train as much as others, but even leg locks. There are a lot of schools that don't like having the lower belts do leg locks, but there are some competitions that allow lower belts to do leg locks. So the idea that if you train at a school that's more traditional and then you go to a tournament that has fairly open rules and you get caught in a leg lock, that you could then sue your instructor for not properly preparing you, I just think that's bizarre. And hopefully that doesn't end up going through. But he was in the 246-pound weight class. It says he's a 246-pound grappler. I don't know if he was actually 246 pounds or if that was the weight class limit that they're referring to. But the opponent that he matched up with was 290 pounds. The coach says that Peters opted not to go to the stand-up training sessions, despite knowing that he'd have to stand up in the tournaments. That's the fact. If you're competing in jiu-jitsu, it always begins standing up. You can pull guard right away. Even if Peters didn't want to stand up, he could have pulled guard right away, but it is kind of known that if you're competing, you're going to be standing up. So kind of bizarre there. He said that the student had also spent 80 hours of mat time prior to entering. What's interesting there is that in this article, it mentions that the guy was training for 8 to 9 months, but if you go to Marcus Suarez's website and look at how long the classes are, it says that all classes are 2 hours long. So if he trained for 80 hours total over 8 to 9 months, that means he did 40 classes in 8 to 9 months. That's not a whole lot of classes. We're talking like once or twice a week. So should he be competing if he's training that little? That's I guess you could argue here or there. It depends on how good you are, how quick you're picking it up. There are some people who, after 80 hours, are a lot better than others, especially if they had like a wrestling background or some other background. But even still, it seems kind of odd that he wasn't training all that often. But he suffered he had to have a knee surgery for the torn meniscus. He's seeking damages for suffering, lost wages, and future capacity to earn wages. It's also worth mentioning that this tournament happened back in 2016, so he began training in 2015. So we're just now getting this case pushed forward in 2019, which is a little bizarre as well. That's quite a long period of time. So I don't need the class structure anymore. So here's the CBC article that's also talking about that. And then a lot of the same stuff here. So despite signing 2 waivers, notice was filed in British Columbia. He was 36. One of his key complaints here is that he says that he didn't know that he was fighting a guy who was 290 pounds. Now, this will happen sometimes at tournaments, whether they're small tournaments or whether there just isn't a whole lot of people signed up. Sometimes they'll try to merge divisions. Based on that, that's something that I have some issues with some smaller tournaments around me. Sometimes at the higher belts, they don't have a whole lot of guys who do the smaller tournaments. So if you want to do them, oftentimes you kind of get bumped up a weight class, but usually they'll tell you that. But in this case, what seems odd to me is that even if they didn't tell him that, and that's his claim, and I'd have a hard time believing it's true, but let's just say it was true. For a guy who's 246 pounds, who's right near the limit, to not know that the guy he's going to be going up against is 290 pounds, like it's not like you can't tell a 45-pound difference, because this guy was weighing at the limit at 246 pounds. So if you go to the site for the tournament here, and this is a more recent one. This isn't the 2016 one, but this is the Marcus Invitational. The weight classes are actually split up at 246.5 pounds. So once this loads up, I can show you that. Yeah, so for super heavy, it's under 246.5 pounds. Then ultra heavy is 246.5. So it looks like he was in the super heavy division. They didn't have anyone for him there, so they bumped him up to ultra heavy. But even still, if you're right at that limit, I'm sure you would know if someone's bigger than you. If something was going on there, you could probably ask and say, "Hey, look, I'm not comfortable. I don't want to go against someone who's 45 pounds heavier than me," which is a little bit odd at some, especially in the heavier weights. It's kind of odd for that to be an issue. I mean, you have people who do absolute who go against guys who are much bigger than them at that point. I guess his point is that he wasn't made aware of it, and that if he was, he wouldn't have taken the match, I guess, which is kind of a weird move regardless, especially if you're a white belt. You kind of want to just get as many reps in as possible in tournaments. Then they're saying in court filing, he suffered leg injuries from a torn meniscus. That was already mentioned. Marcus has a couple different training locations. He received about 80 hours of training, which is kind of odd. I don't know if they have people sign in. I know some schools, I've heard some Gracie Baja schools do that, where they'll have you like check like on a little list every time you show up to class, so they know how often you come. But in most of the places in every place I've trained, they don't really keep track of that, unless, or at least they don't make me sign anything to keep track of it. Maybe they're keeping track on the back end, but that's not something that I've seen happen before. BC judge ruled that the waiver wasn't enough. Eric McGracken, who comments a lot on MMA, had a comment on this as well. He says, from a consumer perspective, it's always important to pay attention to documents that you're signing. A lot of people sign waivers without even knowing what they're giving the right to, or giving up their right to sue. Clearly, that wasn't the case here. And he's also saying, from the school's perspective, the lesson is pretty clear, which is you want to make sure that students understand what they're signing, and the waivers are broad and they cover all the activities the student might be exposed to. And then they're saying he was seeking general damages. They didn't specify what the amount is, which is also kind of odd. But to me, just this general idea of losing in a competition or getting injured in a competition and then suing your coach, or even trying to sue the promoter, it's just kind of a bizarre move to me. It's understood that when you compete in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, you're risking injury. So to go ahead and try to file a lawsuit afterwards when it happens, it's just odd to me. His point about not being properly trained is just a bizarre one that I think if the jury has any idea how martial arts works, that part should at least get thrown out, because that's kind of a stupid idea, especially if they do offer stand-up training in other classes and he didn't go. But even if they didn't, again, you'd figure he could just pull guard if he wasn't comfortable standing up. So that's kind of on him for deciding to stand up and try to apparently get a takedown and getting thrown over his knee. But then the second half, as far as him not knowing that he's fighting a bigger guy, that also seems kind of weird that he wouldn't have been aware of it. I'd imagine they would have told him. Every tournament I've been to, they seem to do a pretty good job of telling people ahead of time if they're moving him up the division. But even if he wasn't told that, like before you step on the mat, you kind of have to know if you're at the limit of your weight class and a guy's 45 pounds heavier than you. Like, you have to know something's up, be able to ask a question and say, "Hey, what's going on here? Like, this isn't normal." And at that point, if you're completely unwilling to fight up a weight class, then I guess you don't compete. But that's just bizarre. It's not often that you see that happen. I've seen people who have this issue in tournaments before where they get bumped to a weight class, but for the most part, people are going to say, "Okay, it's fine. I'll compete up a weight class." Because in the room, most of the time you're training with bigger guys anyway. Now, granted, this guy's 246 pounds, so maybe for him, he might be used to being the biggest guy. So the idea of fighting someone bigger is an issue. But this is jiu-jitsu. Fighting bigger people is kind of the thing you do.